Hey guys, this is your High Fist here with a juicy new topic as always. It's been a while since I did one of these essay type things, maybe 7, maybe even 8 months, so let's see how it goes. I did want it to be a video, but then my camera wasn't working, so I figured, you know what, I might as well record something and put it out there for YouTube. So, the Kachain Chamal, the Malazan lizards, the Malazan dinosaurs, they are the objects of today's discussion. Not since Summer Dev in the Bone Hunters, guys, would you have seen anybody dissect the Kachain the way your High Fist is about to today. So fasten your seatbelts. As you guys know, we've discussed other races on this channel before. One of my early videos was on the moral clarity of the Focrul. I've done one on how the Jagut-Aimas war mirrors the eternal struggle between individualism and collectivism. We've had one on the use of demons for anti-racist political commentary. So I typically like to analyze races by connecting them with ideas and concepts. And if I had to use that lens to study the Kachain, one thing stands out to me above all else, and that's the way in which the Kachain Chamal are humanized in the series, but without having to be made human-like. Let me explain. The idea of humanizing a non-human entity is obviously nothing new in fiction. The Wizard of Oz did it. Steven Spielberg's E.T. did it with an alien. Even in terms of modern fantasy literature, in terms of mythology, I'm sure we can all name many religions, many books, many titles where the quote-unquote other is humanized in some way. And critics go, oh wow, this writer has really humanized the other side, has really humanized the monster, blah blah. But what Erikson does with the Kachain Chamal as a writer is a radical departure from the usual way in which storytellers humanize a non-human creature. Because how writers usually humanize a creature is by making it human-like, by making it anthropomorphic. You want to make trolls more relatable? Oh, easy. You just make them more human-like in terms of the way they behave, and there you have it. You want to humanize aliens and make them more relatable? Easily. Have an alien that strikes up a friendship with a child for us to see how alike the alien and the child are. As in, just make these creatures more human, and the audience automatically sees them as more human. My favorite example of this is Shrek, which I think is one of the most brilliant movies ever made. That's a great example of an ogre being humanized, but he's humanized by making him human-like. He's anthropomorphized to have human-like features. He speaks like the guy from Wayne's World. He's a human being for all intents and purposes, except that he has green skin. You can apply this trick in all mediums of fantasy fiction to creatures like fairies, vampires, dwarfs, orcs, blah blah, where they are just turned into pseudo-humans for us to see them as more sympathetic. Most storytellers do this, and it's a good thing. I personally enjoy subversive stories where we get to see the human side of non-human creatures, blah blah blah, right? I'm not against it. Even in Malazan, we see this done brilliantly with races like the Tilanaimas and the Jagut, where we empathize with them because of how they are so like us, like humans, in so many ways. But with the Kachain, Erikson takes a really different route, which I personally haven't seen done so well anywhere else. He does the complete opposite of what I just mentioned. The Kachain Chamal are never humanized on an aesthetic level. In fact, he goes out of his way to repeatedly remind us that they are different and monstrous, even when we are meant to be cheering for them. At least the other races are somewhat humanoid looking. While they might have disjointed limbs like the Focrul or tusks like the Jagut, the races are all recognizably humanoid in some way. But the Kachin, as we all know, are nothing like that. They are very distinctly non-human in a way that none of the other major races are. The challenge Erikson is throwing out to the reader is, can you empathize with these creatures even if I pull back on these regular cliches and tricks? Can you accept these horror movie creatures for what they are? He somehow manages to quote-unquote humanize them by dehumanizing them, by connecting them with us emotionally, while still stressing on how non-human these creatures are. I think this is important because simply making one side relatable is not special anymore. I'm sorry. While I can see how the fantasy genre was black and white at one point, and where authors could perhaps deserve credit sometime in the past for introducing shades of grey, I don't really think that's unique anymore, and I don't think there's anything special in the way that writers do it anymore. This cliche idea of, oh, the writers made the other side relatable, oh, they've made the villain, the monster relatable, they've humanized the monster. I don't think those are original ideas anymore, and I think authors have to do something beyond these stereotypical tricks to make it something special anymore. I mean, even mainstream Hollywood comic book adaptations now try to make the audience empathize a little bit with their villains and monsters, trying to show the monsters with shades of grey. So all of this is par for the course now. And authors simply making you feel empathy or sympathy for a monster, and author simply humanizing a monster, that's not unique anymore. Erikson goes beyond this shallow level precisely because he stays away from this humanization, and he goes down that dehumanization path to strike a chord with us. Consider the brutality of the Kachin Chamal being led by Gessler and Stormy in the last two books. There is never an attempt made to make them anthropomorphic. They are cold-blooded, alien, lizard killing machines who rip their enemies to shreds. Erikson could have easily played what I like to call the Chewbacca trick, which is what I've been mentioning all along, where you just take a creature and you anthropomorphize it. Chewbacca's meant to be this big hairy beast, but he just runs around and shoots guns like humans do. At no point do we see Chewbacca ripping people to shreds with his claws and with blood dripping down his fangs and all that, even though his body is clearly built for that. And obviously, we will never see Chewbacca doing that, because that would no longer make the character sympathetic. Because that's an example of a character who was humanized aesthetically, who was simply humanized by making a creature look and behave more human. Erikson could have easily done that to make us feel a bond with the Chamal, but that never happens. In fact, he constantly conjures this image of a hybrid between a reptilian race and an insectoid race. They are reptilian in their physical descriptions, the scaly hides, the dead eyes, the Jurassic Park type look, I guess. But the way their society is structured is insectoid in nature. As in, they have colonies with a matron. Everybody in the colony was given birth to by this matron mother, and her scent and pheromones control everything in the hive. Like how ants have workers, soldiers, caretakers, etc., the Kachin have sentinels, hunters, soldiers, blah blah, all of whom are linked mentally to the queen, aka the matron. So there's absolutely nothing even remotely human about the way they live. Contrast this with the way in which we as the readers reacted when we see Jagut mothers and children for the first time, when we see Aima settlements for the first time in Memories of Ice. What's emphasized in those scenes is how human-like the Jagut and Aimas are. Our first look into the Kachin hive in Dust of Dreams, however, demonstrates how unlike us the Kachin are, and that is the focus here. You could of course say that this was accidental and that this distance being created between us and the Kachin doesn't have any deeper significance for us to think about. And that might be true. But I think we can see a very clear pattern that Erikson uses to intentionally create a distance between us and the Chamal. Look at their use of magic, for example, or rather their lack of the use of magic. Right from book 1 to book 10, the jargon used to describe their civilization and their use of magic is stuff like mechanism, device, technology, gears, which are unlike what we hear for everyone else. In fact, the Kachin, if we think about it, are science fiction creatures. They are not fantasy creatures like every other race in the series. They use industrial science as their go-to weapon and way of life. They have these anti-gravity fortresses or spaceships or whatever that can fly. It's all about levers and gears and wheels. It's not about scrolls and spells. And this is clearly a deliberate move to give them even more of an alien flavor in the eyes of the reader. So how does Erikson connect us to them emotionally then? If he isn't making them human-like in their behavior and aesthetic, then what is he doing? How does he get us to root for them? By making us see the humanism in them rather than the human in them. There's a big difference, remember, between simply being human-like and actually displaying humanism, which is what the Kachin eventually do. There's this great air of tragedy about them, like with all the races in the Malazan series, but some, like the Jag, would say that the Kachin are doomed to forever repeat their mistakes until they annihilate themselves. And while once again this historical folly is true of all the other races as well, the Jagut seem to have taken this cycle to a whole new level. They were originally two races. The Kachin take this to a whole new level. They were originally two races, and we don't really have any clear answers about who came first. But we are told that there were long tails and short tails. We are told that the short tails went extinct a long time ago and were later on resurrected or recreated by the long tails, the Kachin Chamal, to serve them. But the short tails were too rebellious and they eventually broke through this control. We are told that the Chamal kind of stand for chaos while the Naruk stand for order. The Naruk seem to believe much more in a sort of larger structure, organization. They are all united together as one entity. They are a hive mind in terms of their species, but they don't seem to be hive-minded in terms of their nests. The Chamal, on the other hand, still have a matriarchal structure where they all have different nests, different colonies, and each matron seems to be the undisputed ruler of her respective nest. While we do know that there have been alliances between the Kachin matrons before, the Kachin Chamal are all very clearly products of their individual colonies and matrons. The nest is the most important thing, not the overall race. While to the Naruk, on the other hand, the species as a collective seems to be the kind of a cohesive trait between them. They seem to be a lot more singular-minded and united. So while the Jagut Aimas wars reflect individualism versus collectivism in many ways, the wars between the long tails and the short tails reflect a struggle between two types of collectivism itself: tribal collectivism and universal collectivism. The Chamal reflect tribal collectivism, where they all work as tiny parts of a larger nest or a colony. The Naruk seem to reflect universal collectivism, where they don't really seem to be split amongst themselves by colony and heritage and all that. If the Chamal are an ant colony, the Naruk are kind of like a locust swarm, I guess. Or at least that's what it seems from the 10 big books. There might be something we get in a new book which changes all this, right? So who knows? This dichotomy between the long tails and the short tails is also an interesting one terminology-wise. If we look at lizards, for instance, just general lizards, we know many types of lizards have detachable tails they can discard when in danger, and a new one then slowly grows, right? The use of short tail and long tail to distinguish between the chamal and the naruk plays with this idea. Because if you think about it, a lizard having a short tail could mean one of two things, right? It's either young and therefore has a short tail, not having grown to its full size yet, or having a short tail could also be a sign of experience and age. It could mean that this lizard has lived long enough to experience danger. This lizard has lived long enough to come out of an ordeal like that, and that it could be much older. And this nicely mirrors the story of the short-tailed naruk, where there's always this question of whether they are older or younger originally than the chamal. Ironically, though, the naruk are slightly more like humans than the chamal are, once again creating this non-human distance between us and the chamal. The naruk have written history like we do, right? In fact, they are described as being obsessive recorders who would use their own skin as parchment to record history. The Kachin Chamal, on the other hand, don't have written history because they transmit memories and messages through pheromones and oils and scents and all that shit. Even the way they record knowledge, therefore, is completely unlike every other race. It's unlike even the naruk. And this leads to one of the big tragedies of the Kachin Chamal. They don't even have the luxury of lying to themselves and glamorizing the past to deal with it, because their history is accurate and singular, since it's being passed down through non-written means. Like Guntmach and Khalid both say, nothing is ever forgotten with the Kachin Chamal, because every detail is passed down genetically from one matron to another, from one generation to another. Dr. A.P. Canavan has a lot of excellent videos on the use of unreliable historical narrative in the Malazan books and the unreliability of historical timelines that are presented to us in general in fantasy books. And this plays into that idea. History is something that can and will always be shaped and reshaped to suit our needs, right? To suit our contemporary needs. It's just a fact. And this ability to write and rewrite the historical narrative about who we are, about our past transgressions and our past glories, this flexibility, this freedom is a big part of what makes human societies the way they are. And the Kachin do not have that gift. They do not have that flexibility or freedom. And here I have to read a brilliant quote from the Dust of Dreams. It's from Gurul, the Shigal assassin, where he highlights this problem that the Kachin have. Open quote, "There could be no convenient rewriting of histories, such as seem common among humans. No invented myths of past glory and honor that never was. The crimes committed back then were as sordid as those committed now or those to come. And in the moment of slaughter, none of that really mattered. Who struck the first blow all those thousands of years ago was without relevance. The only thing that counted was who would strike the last blow." End quote. Look at that quote, right? Gurul knows that unlike other creatures who can glorify the past, and more importantly, other unlike creatures who can all justify the past, who can all justify their history by claiming to be the righteous side, the Chamal simply can't do that. The Chamal have no escape from their history. They don't have the freedom to rationalize their actions with self-deceiving and self-glorifying narratives. They don't even have the freedom to pass on a positive perception of their ancestors to the next generation, because nothing can be rewritten. And once again, this difference emphasizes the bestial, non-human side in them. Gurul finally concludes that by saying, none of it matters in the moment of slaughter. And he has to think this way because his species is devoid of false narratives and justifications, unlike us. In fact, we are even told that all the matrons eventually go mad because of this burden of knowledge. The life of a matron is doomed to end in insanity. The sort of ultimate price of motherhood, I guess, being complete insanity. We have seen the Kachin play a role in how Erikson explores the motherhood theme, especially in Memories of Ice and all that, with the matron being insane. But it's only later that we find out that this insanity is the fate of all matrons, the longer they live. And because of this inevitable insanity, the Chamal have also done some of the worst things in the series. You could argue, in fact, that they've done the singularly most evil act in all of fiction, if what we are told about them is true. Because we are told that through some ritual, the Kachin Chamal matrons brought about the assured destruction of all of existence. We are told that in one version, we are told that a matron, presumably the one in Mon, opened a way into chaos and used that to defeat the Folkral god during their war. But we are also told in other places that it was done by a group of matrons and not just one. So the reader's never given a fixed explanation, but we are told that because of some ritual the Kachin Chamal committed way back in the past, they brought out an eventual end to all of existence, because it means that everything will someday eventually get consumed by chaos. So you might have heard of religious genocide or national genocide. You might have even heard of planetary genocide or even cosmic genocide. But there is something even graver than that, right? This is like multiversal genocide or whatever, where the multitude of realities and universes of Warrens are all now doomed because of the Kachin Chamal. Even though they've not killed everyone instantly, they've essentially murdered all of existence. And these are the guys we're supposed to be rooting for in the last two books. So what else do I have? Oh yeah, their take on religion is extremely interesting. There's a great conversation between Sag Churok and Khalid in The Dust of Dreams, or Dust of Dreams, where he tells her that no matter which religion she chooses, it should never be something with just one God. And here we see glimpses of Kachin Chamal philosophy, which seems to be against the idea of worship, but more so against the idea of monotheistic religion. They believe that a singular God, a monotheistic structure, will inevitably lead to evil and cruelty. They don't worship gods to begin with, but they do believe that if one God exists in a religion, then others have to exist as well. Or this God would just end up crushing everything else. Well, technically, they do have religion. They kind of worship the first dragons and even name their skykeep cities after the first dragons, like Umpalis and all that. But it's not really worship in any sense that you and I would use the word worship. Once again, a completely non-human way of thinking is the Chamal way of thinking. Ultimately, I guess the point of all this is to demonstrate how Erikson has used an alternate approach with the Kachin Chamal, a different approach with the Kachin Chamal that we don't really see storytellers using often. Just when you're about to see them as human, Erikson jumps in and reminds you of how reptilian they are by describing their eyes and their scales and all that. There's this key scene in book 9 again, where Stormy and Gessler just meet the Chamal. And this scene is a great example of what I mean. Just when we're about to start seeing them as vulnerable good guys, Erikson has Gessler noticing that their gaze is lifeless and like that of a lizard. And Gessler observes just how non-human they are in this pivotal moment where we are supposed to be embracing the Chamal finally as part of the side on which the bone hunters are fighting. And Erikson keeps doing this every time we are close to feeling some kind of kinship with the Chamal. Yet another way in which the Chamal are explicitly distanced from us is through the timeline as well. The Chamal are often referred to as demons, not just because they are otherworldly, but because their time is so far in the past that there's almost this sense that they don't belong in our timeline, kind of like dinosaurs, I guess. They're seen as such huge relics of the past that they're sometimes considered demons even because of that. There's the scene in Reaper's Gale where Tok is basically calling the Kachin Chamals demons because he says they're creatures of the far past. As in, not only are they alien to us, to our world in appearance, but they are also alien in terms of the timeline as well. And finally, we see this non-human element hammered in even through the way in which they see us. The Kachin see us, the humans, as alien creatures whenever we get their perspective. Sag Churok even refers to Khalid as a frail alien creature. So there's no sort of attempt to make us look familiar in their eyes either. Erikson shows us that just as how we see them as alien creatures, they see us as completely incomprehensible alien beings as well. And yet, despite all these things that I've listed, how is it that Erikson makes us care for these monsters? Not by making them human, but by appealing to humanism. Their struggles are not quite human, but humans can totally understand and empathize with those struggles. The Chamal matron's version of motherhood is nothing like the human version of motherhood. The Chamal version of a family is nothing like our version of it. And yet it's those little kernels we recognize which ultimately make us root for these non-human dinosaurs. The way they come a full circle where the last matron is finally changing her ways because the old ways have not worked. The way they fight for the bone hunters even after their cause is over in book 9. The way they seem ready to evolve for a new world. Erikson meshes all these themes into just the right sort of mixture for us to empathize with them without anthropomorphizing them. And once again, it's important for us to remember these scenes. There's this very pivotal scene with Khalid and Whiskey Jack, where Khalid says, look, I can't feel anything for, because she's their destriant or whatever, and she tells Whiskey Jack and the bridge burners who are the guardians of the gates of death now, she's like, they're so alien. I feel nothing for them. They're so different. And Whiskey Jack says, and they see you as alien. But we do have to kind of sympathize with them, and we do have to be on our side. And that's kind of Erikson speaking to us as well. It's a great scene where Khalid mirrors how we feel about the Kachin Chamal because of how non-human they are. And Whiskey Jack plays Erikson's role, where he basically says, do not shy away, do not look away from that non-human aspect of their existence. Because it's this non-human nature within them, it's this alien nature that you don't understand about them, which is precisely what makes them human. And this ties in nicely with the story of their redemption as well, which plays such a big part in this, where the last Kachin Chamal matron places her faith in the humans. The other Chamal think the matron has gone insane for adopting human religious structures like a shield anvil and a mortal sword and all that, and they think she's even crazier for wanting humans to fill that position, for looking to humans, frail old human beings, to save their species. And it's this which ultimately humanizes them, rather than them having anything in common with us physiologically or biologically. These are alien monsters who are ultimately humanized in our eyes because they embrace the human spirit, because they embrace humanism as the path to the salvation of their species. They don't start speaking like humans, they don't look like us, think like us, act like us, or whatever, just for us to relate to them. They are just as alien as the aliens from the Alien movie franchise, right? Those scary, creepy things. The Kachin are just as alien as those. And they're kept that way throughout the series as enigmatic, terrifying creatures. But their embrace of humanity makes us see them differently. Much like how Whiskey Jack tells Khaled that she needs to embrace their otherworldliness and find the humanity in them through that. There are other subtle ways in which Erikson plays with this without making it obvious. For instance, the first ever mention we have of the Kachin Chamal in the 10 Big Books is in Gardens of the Moon, when Whiskey Jack is shown to have a souvenir of some sort, which he says the Emperor's old guard all carried around with him. And the souvenir is described as a human arm with a serrated blade attached to the end of the wrist. We find out in later books that it was a Kachin Chamal, and Whiskey Jack even says that it was taken from a Kachin tomb. But at that time, we didn't know that. We thought it was a human limb with a blade artificially attached to the top of the wrist. That's what we think while we are readers of book one. So, ironically, the very first time they are ever mentioned, Erikson makes us think that a Kachin arm is a human arm. And there's also this ironic theme of Whiskey Jack and Dujek discussing the Kachin souvenir, given that the Chamal are relics of the past, and at this point in book one, so are Whiskey Jack and Dujek. And the first time we actually seen Kachin Chamal, there's something interesting with them as well. They are undead and they've just killed Treech. But even here, even though it's a gruesome murder of zombie giant lizards with blades at the end of their arms murdering this giant tiger, whatever, it's a gruesome murder, but it's also a liberating experience for Treech, who then becomes a god after that scene. And this again parallels a Malazan theme we've seen before, which is where something is murder on the surface, but it's also a form of liberation. Like how Cotillion murders the crippled god to liberate him. Squint technically murders Coltane to liberate him. So I find it quite fascinating that the Kachin, the very first time we actually see them, are involved in this overarching theme in the series. So there's so much more to the Kachin Chamal than what seems to be the case when we just look at the surface. So that was my video, guys, or audio, I guess. I know that was a bit disjointed, but I hope some of it made sense. I guess the point I'm trying to make is that the anthropomorphication is very different from the humanizing of characters. Anthropomorphizing somebody is very different from humanizing them. But almost all of what passes as humanizing in the fantasy genre is often just anthropomorphizing. They just made human-like. There is no other reader whom I can think of, and please correct me if I'm wrong, who has used dehumanization as opposed to anthropomorphication as such an effective tool to humanize a non-human species, to humanize a non-human entity, where Erikson is constantly playing this push and pull game, where he goes out of his way to constantly conjure this image of a monstrous species that is monstrous in every literal sense, but also manages to use that dehumanization process to make us root for the monsters and for us to see the humans among the monsters or within the monsters. So tell me what you guys think in the comment section below. Do you feel that the way in which the Kachin are made to be sympathetic is unique, as is my argument? Or do you feel that they are more or less like every other race in the series? This is your High Fist. I hope I gave you, my precious subscribers, some food for thought. Take care, guys, and I'll see you soon.